macht Frieden hierher, ohne ich bald um. Soll das Bier im Keller liegen und ich will die Macht Frieden hierher, ohne ich bald um. Keinen Tropfen im Becher mehr und der Beutel schlapp und leer.
Okay, it sounds lovely. It's from the Hofbrauhaus in Munich, Germany. And what do I want to talk about Germany for? Well, many years ago, some of my friends went to tour Europe, and they went to the Hofbrauhaus. And they did have beer, and they were playing German drinking songs just like that. And then they relayed the story to me that in addition to having beer and German barmaids and German drinking songs, they could see on the walls of the Hofbrauhaus there were swastikas. They had been whitewashed over, but you could still see the swastikas through the paint. Now, if you're young, you might not understand swastikas. Swastikas were one of the main symbols of Nazi Germany, which was I'm going to throw them in the category of fascism because their ally was Italy and they were a fascist regime. Nazi are what German called their philosophy, but it was fascist. And it was not democratic. It was a dictatorship. And it was a dictatorship where you still had corporations, and the corporations were celebrated for producing lots of stuff for the people. What else do we want to know? Well, the Nazi regime was dictatorial, and they didn't believe in freedom of speech, and they didn't believe in freedom of choice. So if you weren't for the Nazi regime or the fascist regime in Italy, you would be rounded up by the secret police, and you would be put into concentration camps. What does it mean? Well, the main thing that was used to control the German population was the news. And the German government had a ministry in charge of news. The ministry was called the Ministry of Propaganda. It was headed by a man named Joseph Goebbels, and his job was to brainwash the German population with whatever lies he could come up with in order to make the Nazi Party look fantastic, Germany look fantastic, and the rest of the world, if they were allies of Nazi Germany, then they were to look good. So fascist Italy and Imperial Japan were the main allies of Nazi Germany. And anyone who wasn't for fascism was an enemy, and that's what the propaganda would talk about, how things were so horrible under the enemy's system. Goebbels was famous for what was known as the big lie. And the way the big lie worked, basically, if you're going to tell lies, the idea is you might as well tell a whopper of a big lie. So they did. And in order to get the population to buy in to this big lie, you keep repeating the big lie over and over and over and over and over, day after day, month after month, year after year. You continuously lie to the population. And what will happen is, at first, some of the people will object and say, that's a lie. But as many of the population don't know right from wrong and take up the slogans of the big lie and the stories of the big lie, the population becomes brainwashed. And even the people who at the beginning said, that's a lie, come to see that it's like a tidal wave of people who are buying in to the big lie. That is Propaganda 101. Why are we talking about propaganda today? Because in our world, we are also being fed big lies. Propaganda, day after day after day after day, through the news media. And even though some people put up their hand and say, they're telling lies, many people are brainwashed because they never lived through World War II. They never heard of Joseph Goebbels. They never heard of propaganda. And they never had a course in media studies in perhaps high school. And they never learned that there is enormous corporate concentration of ownership in the media industry, which means that a small number of corporations own the world media. So if you own those corporations, you can dictate what they say. And who can afford to buy enormous media conglomerates? Billionaires, aristocrats. So that is propaganda. It is telling the people lies day after day to get the people to go along with your agenda. Now, senior citizens, people who are maybe even more than senior citizens, let's say people that are in their 80s, were very young in World War II. So they were alive during the fascist Italians and the Nazi Germans and the Imperial Japanese. And yet, these people in their 80s are watching the news night after night. And they're not putting up their hand and saying, this is what went on in World War II. They're not telling the story. Do they have dementia? A lot of them have dementia, which means they don't have their right minds anymore. They're lost their minds to old age. So who can tell you stories about Nazi Germany if the people who were alive during that time have got dementia? The next generations. I was born in 1965, 20 years after the end of World War II. In the late 1960s, there was an enormous war that was on television every night. It was called the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War was the United States and their puppet state, South Vietnam, against the communist North Vietnam and their sponsor, China, which was also communist. What can I tell you about that war? Well, I was very small, you know. When the news came on, when I was very young, I don't remember. But my first memories of television were, I remember them having broadcasts that said, man has landed on the moon. And there was pictures from the moon. And I did watch television, and I could watch the actors talk, and I understood what they said. But at the end of the TV show, there were really strange things that would happen. Things I couldn't understand would happen at the end of the TV show. I learned that it was called printing, writing, but I couldn't read it. I just got to know that's what it was. So it was letters. It was the ending credits for the TV shows. I got used to them being there. I couldn't read them. I hadn't learned how to read yet, but I remember seeing it and eventually coming to know those are words, and you eventually learning that you can read them. And then at school, we started to read words, and I learned to read. But the first TV shows I watched, I saw that print and I didn't know what it was. So what has that got to do with the Vietnam War? Well, I think I started to get interested in the war when I was a little bit older, maybe when I was 10. And by the time age 10, the war was really over as far as fighting with it. The Americans had left, and the South Vietnamese state was left on its own. And then there was stories on the news about the fall of Saigon. Because once the Americans abandoned South Vietnam, North Vietnam and China invaded and took it over. And the last thing that could happen was the capital city of South Vietnam, Saigon, fell to the communists. And there was an evacuation of the American embassy. They took helicopters from the American embassy and they flew out into the sea and landed on American ships. And so many helicopters flew out of South Vietnam, they didn't have room on the ships for them. So what they would do is the helicopter would land, unload the people, and then the soldiers or the sailors would push the helicopter over the side of the enormous ships into the sea because they didn't have room for them and they weren't going to go back. So, starting when I was about age 10, I kept studying the Vietnam War. Mostly because it was just something that was on television when I was growing up and I didn't understand it. The propaganda campaign of the Americans at the time of the Vietnam War was the domino theory. And the domino theory was, if you allow a communist state to conquer another another free state, and it continues, then the free states will fall like dominoes. Please subscribe and share and tune in to my next talk where I will continue with the domino theory.